Hi everybody, welcome back to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone, and in today's video we're going to be talking about the 2006 Alfonso Cuarón film Children of Men, and also the 1992 novel The Children of Men, which is the original source material for the film that was written by P.D. James, the differences between the two, and why, even though I really love this movie, I also wish that they had made different creative choices in the adaptation of this film. And by the way, this is the third time that I am attempting to record this video. It's now the early hours of the morning. The first version, the microphone wasn't on. The second version, there were technical problems with the microphone. So here we go. Third time's the charm. Oh joy. Hopefully this works out fine. Roll tape.
When you're up against the wall and you cannot fall, so go off, go off, go off, go off, so go off, 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 so go off, go off,
Now I should say there's obviously going to be a ton of spoilers in this video for both the 1992 novel The Children of Men by P.D. James and also for the 2006 film Children of Men. So if you don't want either spoiled, you haven't seen them yet or you haven't read the novel and you want to do that, go away, come back later. If you don't care about spoilers, then watch on. Now, when it comes to film adaptations of written material, they are typically either really faithful to the source material, they might make minor changes, but it's almost like the book basically comes off the pages and comes to life in a cinematic version in a very faithful kind of way. Think of something like John Hillcoat's 2009 film adaptation of The Road by Cormac McCarthy, or Michael Bay's 2016 cinematic adaptation of 13 Hours, the inside account of what really happened in Benghazi by Mitchell Zukov. Now, both of those books are quite different, obviously. One of them is a novel, a fictional work, The Road, and if you haven't read it, I highly recommend The Road. The other one is a non-fiction account of real events, but both of them are very faithful to the written source material. Like I said, it's almost like the book has come to life on the screen in front of you. Then there are the film adaptations which take the source material as a jumping off point and they create a completely different vision. Think of something like Stanley Kubrick's 1980 movie adaptation of The Shining by Stephen King, and infamously there is no love lost when it comes to Stephen King and how he feels frustrated and upset, in fact, I believe, based on some of his commentary, about the way in which Kubrick chose to interpret, or you'd say reinterpret, his original written work. Then there is this film, Alfonso Cuarón's 2006 movie adaptation of the 1992 P.D. James novel, The Children of Men. And this film is kind of a mix of both. There is definitely a change in the vision. There is a rewriting of the source material. Some major changes actually happen here. But at the same time, there is so much in the original novel that Cuarón chose to keep in his film. It's really quite impressive. And it's like the major changes are there, but also he references and utilizes so many of like the elements and the thematic aspects and also just these little things that are present in her novel, and they are also present in the film. I'll give you one little example of this. In the book, Elgar's Nimrod, the classical composition, is actually quite an important piece of music in one particular moment in the novel. Our main character witnesses a quitus ceremony, and we'll talk more about what a quitus ceremony is in just a second. But Elgar's Nimrod is playing in the background as that ritual unfolds. Elgar's Nimrod is also used by Alfonso Cuarón in the opening scenes of the film. Our main character is sitting on a train and there is a propaganda advert from the British government playing in the background on a television screen, and it is none other than Elgar's Nimrod, which is the music used in the background. There's a little brief snapshot from Elgar's Nimrod that is used in that little propaganda advert. It's a great little nod, and there's lots of those kinds of things in the movie. It's like it does a bit of both and. Now, even if you really love the novel, which I do, what this means basically is it's kind of difficult to harbour too much ill will towards Alfonso Cuarón, because basically he's paid so much homage to P.D. James and to her original work in his film Adaptation. There's also other things that I really love about this film. In fact, I would go as far as to say that I consider it to be one of the best films of the modern era, and I also think it is one of the best films that has ever been made. The cinematography from Emanuel Lubezki is just profoundly wondrous. It is truly beautiful, and I think he only bettered this cinematography with his work on The Revenant. In The Revenant it goes to a whole nother level, but this film is just beautiful. The cinematography is wonderful, it's well written, it's well crafted. There are some little issues I'm going to talk about in this video, but basically it is a very, very well crafted film. The introduction of the long and expansive tracking shot was a big part of this movie. Before this film, it was not common to see this particular technique in cinema. It is used all over the place now today, but it wasn't as common prior to this. Now, yes, I know some might be ready to fire away on their keyboards in the comments section. Hey Brendan, what about Goodfellas? That had a really long opening shot. Yes, it did. But what we have with Children of Men is Alfonso Cuarón doesn't just have these long sequential tracking shots where you have characters moving from one scene to the next, to the next, to the next, and they're just being sort of followed by a camera. What you have is a camera that is actually quite rich and expansive. It's moving within the sequence. So, for example, that opening sequence of the film where our main character gets his coffee and the camera follows him out of the coffee shop and then down the road a little bit, and he puts his coffee down because he's going to put some whiskey into his coffee, and as he does that, the camera turns and comes around from another angle, and then the coffee shop explodes behind him. And so you have this one long continuous shot, but the camera is moving around, and not just that, but also the characters are not simply just moving sequentially. It's not like they're moving from one place to the next place to the next place. There are changes in direction for them, and the camera follows them. They dart back and forth. A really good example is that early morning farmhouse escape sequence that is in the film, and I think this is a great example of the camera and the way that it is used in these long and expansive tracking shots. So the main character comes out of the house and then he has to duck back into the house. So it's not like the camera follows him as he goes from point A to point B to point C. It's like he goes point A and then he has to come back a bit and then he goes forward again, and when the other characters are with him and they escape, there is the camera moving around within that sequence. It's a really, really great example of what I'm talking about, and it wasn't common to see this kind of footage, this kind of filmmaking in our cinema before Children of Men. It's actually a bit of a signature of Alfonso Cuarón's, and now it's quite commonplace in all sorts of films to see this, and it really is this movie that kicks off that whole phenomenon in a really big way. The other thing I love about this movie was its depiction of environmental degradation. And I think this is quite a nice touch, because it's a reflection of a world that has lost its sense of the sacredness of human life. Because the first and most important thing in the order of creation is what? The human person. And so if you're not having new human babies, which, by the way, for those who don't know, the basic premise of the film and of the novel is that they are living in a future England and in a world where globally the whole world has gone infertile. There have not been new babies born for many decades. So there are no new children being born. There are no new families forming with new human beings being brought into the world. And so the most important and profound school of love, the family, is not normative anymore in the world. And so unsurprisingly, the world is not having its barbaric edges curbed and civilized by the most important school of love, because it's just not present anymore. And so if you lose respect for the most sacred thing in the order of creation, the human person, then is it any wonder that you're also going to lose respect for other lower goods that are still quite important but are lower in the order of creation, like, for example, the environment? So all of a sudden, because there's no respect for human life, that flows out into a disrespect for the environment. And the way in which that degradation is portrayed in this film, I think, is really quite impressive, and it's just a nice touch. The film is also shot like a documentary, and I think this adds a couple of things. Number one, it adds to the prophetic nature of its subject matter. Now, in this particular particular film, it's about a future world where everyone has gone infertile. Now, that's not something that affects us directly in the same way, but we are now moving into what is called a demographic winter. We have not had enough children. We are well below, most countries are well below their fertility replacement rate. They are not going to be able to replicate and continue on and to grow and to even sustain some basic things as a society that we've had in the past, because we just have not had enough kids. So we are moving into something that is similar, not the same, but similar to what's in this film. And so the use of a documentary style, run and gun, shaky cam, handheld filming technique style really aids and sort of creates a realism that I think adds to the prophetic nature of this particular subject matter. And also it creates a more palpable intimacy with the characters and the events that are happening. And one other bonus about this is not just the intimacy factor, but also the fact that when you do those long, expansive tracking shots, the camera is now right there with the characters, and as it's moving around, that really changes the nature and I think really makes that whole moving tracking shot where things are just really rich and expansive, which we're kind of quite used to now but weren't before this film. It really brings it to life in a special way, the fact that there's a documentary style of filmmaking rather than a camera just stuck on a tripod or on a dolly tracking along beside a group of characters as they move through their scene. Please forgive me, it is the early hours of the morning as I record this the third time around, so I'm not quite as sharp as I would have been if the first version of this had worked yesterday. Now, one other thing, just while we talk about things I really love about this film, there's some beautiful symbolism in this film, and one of those forms of symbolism happens when our main character loses his footwear. So they have to escape from that farmhouse, I was telling you about that earlier, and he cannot take his shoes. He doesn't have time to get his shoes, and so they leave under cover of darkness, and he leaves his shoes behind, and then when they get to their next destination, he has to work through a pile of footwear to try and find something that will fit his feet. And the only thing that comes remotely close to fitting his feet are a pair of jandals, what you might call flip-flops in another part of the world. This is footwear that is appropriate for a day at the beach. It is not appropriate when you are on the run. So in this particular part of the film, he is now, our main character Theo, is on the run with another couple of women. So what's happened is the very first pregnancy in decades has happened, a brand new pregnancy. A young African girl is pregnant for the first time in decades, and our main character is helping her and her midwife to escape. And so what's happening now is he has lost his footwear. He has to put on a pair of jandals, a pair of flip-flops that are only really appropriate for a day at the beach. And by the way, this is another callback to the novel, because in the novel, which you don't get in the film, our main character, when he witnesses the quitus ritual, again, we'll talk more about and explain what that is in just a second, he is at the beach. And so here you have the character in the film wearing beach footwear. It seems kind of appropriate in a callback to the novel. But it's also beautifully, on a symbolic level, like it's also beautiful symbolism, because what you've got here is a character who is now very vulnerable. His footwear is not appropriate when you are on the run from a band of armed revolutionary terrorists who are hunting you down, and through some pretty rough terrain. Jandals is definitely not what you should be wearing. So you're vulnerable. You're also totally out of your depth. There's a symbolic sort of sense of being totally out of your depth when you turn up wearing jandals to escaping and saving the world from infertility. Like, that's not the footwear that you wear. And so it's symbolic of him being totally out of his depth, which is true. That's exactly what he is in this situation. And of course it's also symbolic of him leaving his old life behind. And that's what's happening here. His old shoes, which were the vessel, the vehicles through which he sort of transported himself day to day through his old life, they have now been lost to him, and he has these new, well, no, not shoes, this new footwear that he's wearing that basically is symbolic of his old life being shed. And that's exactly what's going on at this moment in the film. And I thought that was just a beautiful piece of symbolism. And speaking of beautiful scenes, let me say one other thing. That scene of the baby departing the siege in the refugee camp at Bexhill in the film is one of my favourite scenes in all of cinema. I find myself in tears every single time I watch that sequence. So you've got this war going on, basically. You've got soldiers fighting each other. There's a tank there. And all of a sudden, out of this ruined, shelled building, in the midst of all this chaos, brokenness, carnage, broken down buildings, etc., you hear the cry of a newborn baby, and suddenly a man and a woman emerge with this baby. They have not seen a new baby, they have not heard a new baby in decades, and all of a sudden it just cuts through all of the darkness and the noise and the violence, and everything stops, and you have people staring in awe and in wonder. You have soldiers who get down on their knees. Some of them make the sign of the cross, the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, as the baby passes them by. This is a truly sacred moment, and this film just represents it. Like, it's so beautiful, that sequence, and it speaks to the wonder and the sacredness and the importance of every single human life, and it does it so beautifully. And to make it even better, the soundtrack choices in that particular moment, the beautiful classical piece that is playing in the background, just really elevates it to a whole another level. By the way, this is a very underrated soundtrack. One of the first things that I did after watching this movie all the way back in 2006, when I went with my wife to see it at the cinema, one of the first things that I did was track down a copy of the soundtrack for this film on CD back then, of all media, but it was on CD. I've still got that CD. It is so profoundly beautiful, and it is underrated. It's not just classical, there's a mix of different music styles in this film, but the musical choices in this film are excellent, and they really elevate it. It's a great soundtrack. And this is also another parallel and a drawing back to the original novel, because as soon as the baby passes them by in this scene, they go back to their fighting. The war literally starts up again. So in other words, the baby doesn't suddenly make them all saints, and that's exactly what we see depicted in the novel as well. Now, having said all of that I love about this film, and there's more as well that I thought, well, we've only got so much time, so I'll just touch on some of the things I really love. But the key thing to note is I really do rate this film. I think it is one of the best films that's ever been made, and I certainly think it is a pinnacle moment in modern cinema. It really is that good. But having said all of that, there are some big differences, like I mentioned earlier, between the original novel and this film adaptation. And one or two of them, I think the choices that are made in the adaptation, the film adaptation, are actually detrimental to some of the essential thematic elements of the original story. In fact, they are so detrimental that those essential and original elements that were in the original written version of this work are either degraded, or in a couple of cases they are even entirely lost from the film as a result of this, and it's actually detrimental. There's two or maybe three in particular that I'll get to, which I think were a disaster, basically, that they are tragic. It doesn't make the film bad, it doesn't ruin anything. This is a great film, but because of those choices, I think there's something tragic that's happened here. Something has been lost that is important because of one or two of these key choices in the film adaptation that is actually still present in the original novel, the written work. So let's start by talking about that, and the way to do that, I think, is by contrasting some of the key differences between the film adaptation, which is called Children of Men, we should note this difference, and the original novel, which was called The Children of Men. So it's different, and that difference is kind of important, and we'll talk about why that change in title is a reflection of one of the big things that has been lost in the film adaptation as we go through this particular video. But we'll come to that distinction soon, because I think, as I said, it highlights some of the key thematic changes which, mean that the novel version is far superior, and the film adaptation, despite its greatness, is not as great as it actually could have been. So let's start with the character of Theo Farron, our main character. Theo is no longer an Oxford historian. In the novel, he's an Oxford history professor, but in the film adaptation, he's now a bureaucrat, and he works in the government managerial classes. The film also hints that he possibly is a gambling addict, and that he might even be plagued by gambling debts. There are several major hints to this. I mean, not only the fact that we have a scene of him betting on the greyhounds at the racetrack, but also we have characters offering him a sum of money to do a thing like $5,000, and they indicate that he really needs the money. And then at another point, he tries to up the amount that he's paid. So he tries to increase the amount to $7,000, another couple of grand. And all of this indicates that not only does he seem to have possibly a gambling addiction, but maybe there are issues here that leave him in debt. In the book, Theo is the cousin of Zan Lipiot, and Zan Lipiot is the warden of England. Basically, he's a dictator in this dystopian world. The novel is a dystopia, and that's a very strong aspect that is kind of weakened, I think, in the film adaptation. But it's a modern dystopia, and it is led by Zan, who is the dictator of the United Kingdom, and he leads through a small group, a governing group of technocrats, a bit of an oligarchy known as the Council. Now, Zan is obviously completely absent from the film, and the Council is completely absent from the film. And I think this is one of the weaknesses, actually. You get a sense that they're living in a dystopian world, but you don't get a strong sense of that because you never really get introduced to how this world is being run. And there's a reason for that. They've made some particular choices which we'll get to, but Zan and the Council is completely absent from the film adaptation. In the film, Theo's cousin is now called Nigel, no longer Zan, and he's not a dictator. He's just a high-level state official who runs a project called the Ark of the Arts, which is basically something that exists to save and curate important works of art. And again, this is another callback to the novel, because in the novel there is this sense of a world that is dying, and what will they do to curate their history? That's certainly something that is touched on in the novel. And so again, we're getting lots of these callbacks to the novel here. Now, it feels to me, when I think about the film adaptation, like the deletion, the decision not to include the character of Zan and the other members of the council was probably, I think, most likely about cinematic efficiency. What do we include with the time that we have? However, what this means is that the themes of technocracy and eugenics are missing in the film. And these are big thematic elements of the novel, but they're not present in the film. And I think that's a real shame. Now, there are more important and impactful things that are missing from the film, and I'll get to a couple of those towards the end. However, I think it's definitely a shame that these key aspects of the novel are lost to the film, because related to this is the downgrading of the quitus. Now, in the novel, the quitus is a euthanasia ritual. It's a mass suicide of the elderly that takes place. And what happens is the elderly, we're told in the novel that originally this was something that a group of elderly people put themselves on a bus and drove themselves to the English coast, to one of the beaches, and they just committed mass suicide by jumping off the cliffs. And the government didn't like this, and so they got involved in this process. And they didn't get involved to try and stop it because of the evils of euthanasia and because of what's happening to these vulnerable elderly people. No. And this really speaks to the technocracy of this world and the eugenic nature of things. They got involved to make it more efficient, because it wasn't efficient enough and it wasn't clean. People were seeing bodies, and they didn't like that. So this government, which is technocratic and obsessed with eugenics, gets involved to create a very efficient mass suicide, a mass euthanasia ritual, quote unquote, because what they're actually doing is, even if there may be volunteers within their group, it seems that the majority are actually being killed by the state. They are just being euthanized, and there's no choice whatsoever on their part at all. And so what happens is they have these ceremonies where they bring the elderly out. They have music playing, Elgar's Nimrod, we talked about that earlier. They put them onto these boats. They chain them to the boats, these dinghies. They float these boats out into the water. And then what they do is they sink the boats and they kill these elderly people. And so this is the quitus. But in the film, the quitus is now just a simple suicide kit. It's a box with some poisonous drugs in it that is sent to every home for them to take and to kill themselves. And I think that downgrading of the quitus is, again, this is a shame, because the whole theme of eugenics and some key themes in the novel are now lost because of this. And it's also, the quitus is also a key motivation of a group called the Five Fishes. In the novel, they are a small group of political activists, literally 5 people, the Five Fishes. And the reason they're called the Five Fishes is because there's 5 people, and they take their name, their code names, from the names of different fish. So if your name was Brendan my first name, my Christian name begins with B, for example, I would take the code name Bass from the bass fish. So my fish code name corresponds with the first letter of my Christian name. If I was called Charles, I would take the name Cod, for example. So each of them, these 5 people, they have a code name from a fish, and they are the 5 fishes. And what the 5 fishes do is they start blowing up the harbour ramps. They don't target people in this. They do it in such a way as to try and avoid taking human lives. But they blow up the harbour ramps where the quitus ceremonies are happening in an effort to impede the killing of the elderly through this quitus euthanasia. And so they can't launch the boats, right? That's why they're doing this. Now in the film, the 5 fishes are now just the fishes, and they are a large revolutionary militia organisation that has even previously carried out terrorist bombings where they've actually killed people in acts of terrorism. So this is quite different. Now in the film, they are now led by Theo's ex-wife called Julian. We'll come back to her in just a second because this is a major change from the novel. But why this matters though is that the quitus is not just a central motivating factor in the plot of the original story, and it's not just about the theme of eugenics, but it also leads to a very important event in the life of Theo Farron, our main character. So in the film, the character of Jasper, played by Michael Caine, is a political cartoonist and a long-time friend of Theo's. But in the novel, Jasper is actually one of Leo's former professors from Oxford University, and he also has an elderly wife called Hilda. In the film, Hilda's name has now been changed to Janice. At one key point in the novel, very early on, Theo has the opportunity of allowing the aging Jasper and his infirm wife Hilda to come and live with him in his very large, oversized house. It really is big. It's 2 stories, he's got all these rooms. It is far too big for him, and he could easily share it with them. But Theo selfishly rejects this possibility. And in the novel, there's this sort of inner narrative, this inner monologue he has about how he believes he doesn't owe this obligation to them, etc. This is really creating a sense of the selfishness of the world in which these characters inhabit, and it's quite important to the story as it unfolds subsequently. Now, subsequently, what happens to this after he has rejected them coming to live with him is when he goes to witness the quitus ceremony, because the 5 fishes say to him, go and witness this quitus ceremony for yourself and you'll see the truth about what's really happening. They are lying to you. Euthanasia is not a good thing. They are lying to you about what's going on. And when he goes to witness the quitus, who does he encounter there being killed on one of these boats? None other than Hilda, Jasper's elderly, infirm wife, and he tries to save her, but he is unable to save her. And this is quite an important point in sort of his change of motivation and his actions in the story. Now, later on in the novel also, he finds Jasper at another point dead in his own home, because he's taken his own life and he's done it in solitude. And so this, again, is really important because this is quite key for Theo as a character and his motivations, but also for what it says about the elderly and the vulnerability of the elderly and the way in which they're often coerced by powerful forces outside their control. And that's happening in our society today, and this is quite important, and I think it's a real shame that this was lost. Now, what we get in the film instead is a very markedly different, and I think it's obviously clearly missing the weight of these essential things. In the film, Jasper kills his own wife with the quitus kit, and then he is shot by members of the fishes who turn up to his house because they're hunting for Theo and for this young pregnant woman. And so all of a sudden, the act of euthanasia is not what it is in the novel, and it's also kind of sanitized because there is a way in which you can view that scene, I think, as almost glamorizing euthanasia and presenting it as a good thing, as a dignified thing. And so what's happened here is that the impact and the key moral themes and explorations of these issues is kind of weakened as a result. And certainly the emotional impact of that aspect of the plot is very much lessened as a result. Which brings us to one of the major changes in the film adaptation of P.D. James's The Children of Men. In the original story, Julian, who we mentioned just a moment ago, is one of the members of the 5 fishes. She has a physical birth defect. It doesn't explain to us why she has this defect, but she has a deformity of her hand. And when I was reading the description in the novel, my first thought was, is she a thalidomide baby? It seemed that possibly that was the case. But either way, it doesn't explain why. She, in the novel, is married to Rolf, and Rolf is the leader of the 5 fishes, a very ambitious man. But Julian has also become pregnant to another member of the 5 fishes, a man called Luke, who is an Anglican vicar. He's basically kind of like semi-retired. He's been pushed out of the church. He's a very kind-hearted man, and also he suffers from epilepsy. And this is quite important because remember, this is the first pregnancy in decades. So what you've got is you've now got a mother who has a physical deformity and a father who has a serious illness, and they are the mother and father of this first baby born around the world, anywhere in the world, in decades. Now, Theo meets Julian in the novel, and then he later falls in love with her after his former wife Helena has left him for another man, so that's happened earlier. And the reason why their marriage has collapsed is because this whole unraveling of their marriage starts to happen, their relationship, after their daughter Natalie is killed in a drive-by accident. And Theo's responsible for this because Theo is backing his car out of the driveway one day and he accidentally hits and kills his daughter Natalie. And so this is the beginning of the end for their marriage. Now, in the film version, the character of Julian, played by Julianne Moore, not to create any confusion, is now Theo's ex-wife. So she's not just a stranger that he meets and falls in love with, she is now his ex-wife. And in the film adaptation, she's not the pregnant character in the story anymore. She's got nothing to do with that at all. And it was a son named Dylan that they had lost previously. So they didn't have a daughter named Natalie, they had a son named Dylan, and their son is not killed by Theo in a driveway accident involving the car. Dylan, in the film adaptation, their child, was killed when a global flu pandemic overtakes the world. Now, this is another important difference in the film adaptation in relation to all of this, because in the film adaptation, Julian is portrayed as the one who is less emotionally invested in the death of their young child than what Theo is. But this is a complete reversal, and it's the polar opposite of the novel, which clearly, there's absolutely no equivocating on this point. The novel makes it clear, and this is part of the sort of the building of Theo as a character, that it is Theo who is the distant and less emotionally invested of the two parties in the loss of their young child. And again, it sort of speaks to his selfishness. And why these changes matter is that there's sort of a loss of emphasis on Theo's guilt, on his own self-interested behaviours and attitudes. It's all disappeared from the plot, and there's some sort of key character flaws in the novel that are not present in the film. And it's kind of now obvious why they've done things like made him into a gambler, and they've sort of indicated that he has other character flaws, but they're quite different and they're not as impactful as what you get in the novel. And even more importantly, again, the essential element of eugenics has been completely stripped from the story, because in the novel, as I said earlier, you have a man and a woman who are considered genetically inferior. You have one who is an epileptic and one who has a physical deformity, and they are now the new Adam and Eve. They actually now hold the key to the salvation of the whole human race, and they are considered unfit people in this dystopian world, and yet they are the very people the world needs to be saved from the predicament that it finds itself in. And the reason why also they are able to sort of operate under the radar with this pregnancy is because they're also not tested in the novel, because they're deemed to not be valuable. They're deemed to be unfit. They're genetically inferior. So why would you test these people for fertility? You don't want them. They're not the right kind of people that you want breeding. And so that's why they are able to hide the pregnancy for so long. And again, it speaks to the eugenic technocracy here, because they're not considered important to humanity, but in actual fact they really are. Now, the other thing that's important about all of this is the character of Luke. Luke, remember, is the father of the baby, and what this means is that the changes to Luke in the film mean that basically there's been a loss of this very powerful emotional impact that you get in the novel when Luke is killed. Because basically in the novel what happens is Theo is now on the run, and he's helping the 5 fishes to escape, and they're in a vehicle when a group of Amigas trap and surround them on a forest road. The Amigas are what the novel calls the final generation of young people who were born before everyone went infertile. And these amigas, this entire generation, are pampered and they're very entitled because they are treated in a way that is basically unhealthy, the way they are almost worshipped. And some of them basically fall into this nihilistic despair to such a degree that they form these gangs, they paint their faces, and they commit acts of violence on the outskirts of the cities. And they do things, including like what's depicted in the novel, these ritualistic sacrificial killings of people with dances and, ceremonial chanting and all the rest of it. And that's what's going on in the scene in the novel when they are trapped in the vehicle. And Theo comes up with a plan, and he says what we should do is we should get out of the vehicle and we should join in the ritual. That will kind of probably throw them off guard a little bit if we join in with the ritual. And then what we'll do is, as the ritual moves, Rolf, the husband, and Julian, his wife, and their pregnant unborn child, Julian is pregnant with their unborn child, they will, when they get close to this wall that's nearby, they'll jump over the low point in the wall and they will escape. And the rest of them, including Luke and Theo and Miriam's there as well, they will remain there and they will potentially even sacrifice. Like one of them will sacrifice themselves, their lives will be lost. But they'll do that in order to allow the mum and the dad and the baby to escape, and they save the future of humanity by doing this. And what happens in the process is Theo and Miriam, the midwife, they actually do manage to escape. Obviously, Rolf and Julian get over the wall first and escape, but Luke is killed. He is the ritual sacrifice who is killed by these brutal, barbaric amigas. And what happens is you don't find out about the fact that Luke is the father of the baby until after he is dead. And this has massive impact in the novel, and it's quite a key motivating factor for different characters. But why it's so impactful is because in this dystopian world, it is the fertility of the males that is really important. And so what you realize now is everyone thought, including us, the reader, that Rolf was the father, and Rolf, the father of the baby, has been saved, right? So that means humanity is saved. You've got a fertile male, and you've got his wife who's having a young girl, and so the world is saved because the fertile male, Rolf, is safe. But in actual fact, Rolf's not the father of the baby. He's infertile, and the fertile male, Luke, is the one who's actually been killed. So it's quite impactful. Now, in the film, this has now been changed completely. So what you have here is no longer this big focus on the issue of eugenics and technocracy and other things like this. Instead, it's the issues of racism and immigration. The pregnant mother in the film adaptation, it's not Julian, it's a young African refugee called Key. And the father is completely absent. He is literally irrelevant in the film adaptation. He's not even named or known. There's a brief line in a very brief scene where we are told that basically he does not matter at all. And I think this is a shame, not because of just the loss of the character Luke, but also because it fails to respect, I think, and uphold the importance, the profound importance of the first and most essential of all communities, the human family, a mum and a dad and their children. And it really is quite important, and that is kind of lost to the plot. Now, Luke, the character of Luke in the film, is not the character of Luke from the novel at all. Completely different character. Luke, in the film adaptation, is now a duplicitous and traitorous senior leader of the Fishers who actually conspires to have Julian killed in the film so that he can take charge and use Key and her baby for his own political revolutionary ambitions. Now, this is kind of a combination of the characters of Rolf and Luke from the novel, but Luke in the novel is a kind-hearted, genteel sort of soul. He is not Luke as we see him depicted in the film at all. That is actually more like Rolf in the novel, and we'll talk about that in just a second, which brings us to another major change in the story in the film adaptation, and that's the final act of the film. In the novel, as I said, Theo helps the remaining members of the five Fishers to escape, and then he helps them to seek a hiding place, a cabin in the woods where Julian's baby can be safely born. And this is one of the sort of thematic elements that's lost, or certainly not as strong in the film adaptation, but very much you get a sense of in the novel, there is definitely these allusions to the Holy Family from the Christian scriptures, Mary and Joseph and the baby Jesus, as they sort of flee, like the nativity, that sort of sense of this, Joseph type character who's caring for a woman who is carrying a baby, this divine child that is not his child, but he has to care for and nurture and protect them, and they have to find a place to have the baby, but there's nowhere for them to actually be housed, be homed for the birth, like there's no room at the inn, all that kind of stuff. And so that's quite strong in the novel. It's not so there are allusions that you can see quite clearly in the novel to that, but that's really not present at all, I don't think, in the film, certainly not in a strong way. But here's Theo, he's helping them to escape and for the baby to be born. And remember, Luke has been killed in this ritual killing in the novel, and we discover immediately after that Luke was actually the father of the baby. And so Rolf now basically flies into a bit of a rage, and he decides to betray the group to Zan. Now, the reason why he's deciding to betray the group to the dictator of England, because previously, when he thought he was the father of the baby, he actually had a plan to exploit and use this child for his own political gain. He thought basically the nation of England will love me and they will allow me to become the new dictator, the new warden of England, because I am their saviour. I am the fertile male. I am the one who holds the key to their future happiness and salvation. And so I will be all-powerful. And he has this big nefarious plot. He's going to exploit his own wife and his own child for this purpose. Now, when he realises that Luke is actually the father of the child and not him, all of a sudden it's obvious, well, he's now useless. He does not have any power. And so what he does is he decides then to change the game. And what he does is he goes to betray them to Zan, and that way he will have power. So if he sells them out, then hopefully he will be able to attain some important seat on the council or something like that for himself. The important end result of all of this, though, is that Zan, the dictator of England, and the council, this ruling technocratic oligarchy, personally travel to the wooded cabin where Theo, Julian, and her midwife, Miriam, are now hiding because they've been betrayed. They know where to find them. And what happens is, as a result of this, Miriam is killed by Zan, and then Theo ends up shooting and killing Zan, his cousin, and he also takes the royal coronation ring that Zan has taken to wearing. Even though he has no right to be doing this, the novel tells us this, he's taken the royal coronation ring and he wears it on his finger as a symbol of his power as the dictator, the warden of England. And so Theo takes this coronation ring off his finger and he puts it on his own finger. He gives it to himself, basically bestows that power upon himself, and then he baptizes the new baby. And basically the novel ends with him becoming the new ruler, the new father of England, and it leaves this sort of open-ended sort of question of, well, what happens next? Now, in the film version, only the thinnest aspects of this remain. So Theo is obviously still on the run in the film version. He's with the pregnant Key, and he's also with the midwife, who's also called Miriam, but there is no Zan. And instead of Theo becoming the ruler of England, he actually aids Key to deliver the baby, and also then to escape and deliver her safely into the hands of a group called the Human Project, who are waiting in a converted commercial fishing boat offshore. But in order to get to the boat, they must first be smuggled into the Bexhill refugee prison camp. It's not so much a camp as it is a city that has been walled off and is, surrounded by the military. Like think of basically, imagine a city that has been turned into an open air prison. It's like a prison colony. It's not like a refugee camp with tents. It's not that kind of thing. But there's fighting and there's obviously all sorts of dysfunction in the place. It's not a great place to be, but they have to be smuggled in and they have to escape through the Bexhill refugee camp to the coast, because it's right there on the coast. And so they are smuggled into the camp by a prison guard called Sid. Sid knew Jasper. Jasper, remember, is now dead in the film adaptation. He's been killed by the 5 fishes previously. But Jasper grew weed and he was selling it to Sid, so he was his drug dealer, and so they were, I wouldn't say friends, but they knew each other. And so Jasper makes an agreement with Sid to smuggle them in to this refugee prison camp city. Now, while they are there, a major armed conflict erupts between the British Army and the Fishers, this terrorist organisation. And even though Key escapes, Theo is shot as a result of all of this in the process of escaping, And then when they're out on the dinghy waiting for the human project to arrive, just as the human project boat arrives to collect and save them, what we see is Theo drops his head and he's been obviously shot and he's bled out and he dies. Now, it kind of makes sense why they have done this. It is not an unusual trope to have a main character in a film, as part of their hero's journey, actually sacrifice themselves to save others. And so it's kind of obvious that this might happen. It's not unusual at all. However, I personally feel that these changes fundamentally alter and weaken the story as a whole. Now remember, this is a great film. And I'm not backing away from that at all. It is a phenomenal film. But it's unfortunate that some of the highs and the sort of the greatness of the novel is lost in the film adaptation. So, firstly, this film version was released in 2006, which is really when you have the apex of the global condemnation of the US invasion of Iraq and the unjust and indefinite detention of foreign prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, etc. That really is at its apex at that point. And so this final act in the film is where the politicization of the film takes precedence over the storytelling. And instead of it being about what it should actually be about, which is this dystopian world where everyone has gone infertile and the characters in that world, and this new pregnant woman and what all of that means, all of a sudden, it becomes about the political aspects of 2006 rather than the fictional world in which these characters inhabit. Now it's actually about the Iraq War. We are shown refugee prisoners, for example, like regularly throughout the film, housed in cages. We see prisoners with black hoods placed over their heads. There is a depiction of a prisoner being abused in a manner that comes directly from the atrocities that were committed by the US at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. Remember that famous photo, or I should say infamous photo, where you have an Iraqi prisoner who's standing on a box and he has this cloak that's been made for him. It appears like it's like a black cloak. It's cut in a jagged way, so it's got like jagged triangular edges hanging off it. His arms are up like this. He's being forced to hold his arms out, and he has like a hood and a black dunce cap, like that comes to a point on his head, and he's standing there like this, and he's being humiliated and tortured in this way. Now that exact scene is replicated. There is a refugee prisoner who is treated in exactly that same way. We see that in a brief sequence of this movie. And we are even shown at one point the entry gate to this refugee area. The words Homeland Security are written very clearly above the gate. So there's no subtlety here. There's no hiding their colours. The flag has been firmly nailed to the mast. They are wearing their heart on their sleeve. This film has now become about Iraq, about US imperialism, about modern war atrocities, etc., etc. Like Islam, refugees, they're a big part of it as well. But what that means is this film is not actually now what it should be about, which is a world in a demographic oblivion due to a mysterious infertility. It's about the rise of a dictator and the technocratic oligarchy and their use of eugenics as a tool for state control and for controlling society and for manipulation and power and everything else. Plus the theological question of like, where is God in the face of this slowly unfolding apocalypse? That's quite an important theme in the novel, completely absent. We'll get to that point in just a second in the film. And of course, it should also be about the way in which these characters respond to the moral demands that are placed upon them as a result of this big picture, this world in which they inhabit. Like in the novel, one of the key elements of the story are a group called the Sojourners, and the Sojourners are effectively an immigrant slave labour class who are being exploited by the more powerful nation of England. So the elites in England are importing these people and they are using them as a slave labour class, and then they are exporting them when they no longer serve any purpose. And it's amazing how this actually foreshadowed the current situation we find ourselves in with Western immigration policy and the debate that's going on around that. Because what you'll now commonly find online is people who push back when someone says, I think we should tighten our border controls. You'll have people who push back against them, and it's common to hear them saying things like, who will clean your toilets? Who will, serve your fast food? Who will do the jobs that you don't want to do? And this is basically people telling on themselves here. They are saying the quiet part out loud. What they are effectively admitting to here is that immigrants are being treated as like a slave labour class. And so who will do all this slave labour? Who will do these jobs that you don't respect and don't pay people properly for, and you don't respect the dignity of workers in these areas? Who will do those jobs if we don't have a slave labour class that we can bring across our borders to do that? So it's very prescient what the novel is doing here. It's actually foreshadowing this current situation in quite a powerful kind of way. But in the film, there are no sojourners now. Instead, we have what are called the Fugees. And Fugees is slang for refugees. But this aspect of the film, while it might have had some cachet and some political capital back in the 2000s, doesn't really have that anymore, and it doesn't make sense to this particular story anymore. Because, as I said, it's not really relating to the heart of what's going on in this world. Instead, it's focusing on events that happened back through the 2000s. And so back then it had real impact. You watched that stuff and immediately your mind was drawn to what was going on in the world back then. But we are now decades away from that, and that's not happening anymore, and so it doesn't carry that same sort of impact. And more importantly, it doesn't actually relate directly to what's actually happening and the world they've started to build in the film, but then move away from. Basically, in a nutshell, P.D. James got it right. Alfonso Cuarón got this wrong. Why in the world would a rich nation with an aging population and no young labouring class coming through, because no new babies are being born, so they can't keep the system going? They need labourers in the system, and they haven't got any. So why would that society be so committed to rounding up and expelling everyone they find who's not a local from their society and putting them in camps and sending them away and killing them and everything else? Why would they be doing that when this is exactly what they need? An easily exploitable labour class, a group of labourers who can maintain their status quo for as long as possible, and you can exploit them. You don't need to treat them in the same way you treat other workers. So they wouldn't be trying to expel them, they would actually be trying to exploit them. And P.D. James got that right. Alfonso Cuarón didn't. He didn't think through, I don't think, the implications of the actual heart of the story like P.D. James did. She clearly sat down and thought, well, what would happen? How would those in power react if they were living in a world where everyone was infertile? What would that mean, and how would they react to it? And her story is written accurately according to that premise. What you have with Alfonso Cuarón is he focuses instead on issues around Iraq and US imperialism, etc. And as a result, he creates a film in which his conclusions, the things that end up on screen, if you like, they're not congruent with this world. They don't make sense. That's not how the people in power would actually act. And as I said, this is exactly what we've seen playing out in the West in recent years. Even though we're not facing mass infertility, we still have this question of border control and immigration, and this very same argument about the exploitation of immigrant workers is playing out in our midst right now. Which brings me to the character of Miriam, because this is one major change where I think the film has definitely made a mistake. And this is, like I said, there were some minor things, some minor defects in the film, and I think so many of these defects centre around Miriam. In the novel, Miriam is a far more well-drawn, meaningful and compelling character. P.D. James wrote her as a wise, sage Jamaican midwife, basically. She is strong, she's intrepid, and she's also selfless. And her backstory is quite important to Theo's journey too, because in her backstory, her brother was brutally imprisoned for petty theft. And in this dystopian world, what they do is they have an open-air prison colony again. And so the refugee camps that we see, like Bexhill in the film adaptation, again, they're a callback to the novel, but the novel is different. So what's happened is they've turned the Isle of Man basically into a new Van Diemen's Land, a new Australia. Except this time, they are just exporting all of their criminals to the Isle of Man, and they are leaving them to it. There are no governors. There is no one from the British Empire in charge to keep control and to keep order. And it is basically a dog-eat-dog sort of evolutionary survival of the fittest, might makes right type world. And her brother is sent there for petty theft. He really shouldn't be sent there. His supposed crime is not really an appropriate crime to be sending a man off to a prison colony at all. And what happens is her brother eventually manages to escape, and he tries to hide in Miriam's house, but he's captured and then murdered by the state security police. And this is quite an important event. It's a big part of her backstory. It gives her depth. It gives her investment in what's going on. It explains her commitment to the five fishes. And also, it's important for Theo and bringing him into his involvement and commitment to the cause of the five fishes. But the Miriam that we get in the film is an anemic and pale, literally pale, imitation of this formerly great character from the novel. In the film, she's now a white, new age hippie midwife who has dreadlocks. What's even worse is that she is summarily yanked from the plot in the film before she can even fulfill the key role of Miriam in the story. And that key role is to oversee the safe birth of humanity's first infant in decades. But she's yanked from the plot before that even happens. In the film, she's grabbed off the bus by like this psychotic refugee camp guard as they're being smuggled into Bexhill. She's grabbed off the bus, and the implication that we see presented to us in the film is that she's actually also killed. That sort of hints at the fact, because there's a line of bodies lying on the floor, that quite conceivably she's actually going to end up being killed by these guards as well. But this whole sequence, not only I think was this one of the most poorly written scenes in the movie, it just kind of doesn't quite make sense. Basically what you've got here is Deus ex machina. The hand of God steps into the plot and makes a change because they wanted her gone. And so they just did it. But it doesn't make sense. Like, why is the guard pulling refugees off the bus in the first place? It's not really clear why this is happening. It's not clear what their selection criteria is. Why would they want her off the bus? Why do they stop when they do? Why do they only take 2 refugees off the bus? It's kind of just, it's confusing. It doesn't really make sense. It is Deus ex machina. A thing happens because they wanted it to happen. They wanted her gone. So they just pull her out of the plot. But in the novel, this is not what happens at all. Not only is she a more well-drawn and a better crafted character, a more complex and meaningful character in the novel, but she actually fulfills her key role in the story. She brings the child safely into the world and then deliberately leaves Julian and the new baby with Theo, and then she departs that cabin in the woods where the baby is born in an act of heroic virtue, of self-sacrificial love, and this act of heroic self-sacrificial love results in her murder. But she leaves that cabin knowing that there's a really high likelihood that she won't come back. And so this, for me, like I said, is one of the great tragedies of the film adaptation, because we have lost so much here. Because one of the major issues with all of this is that Miriam is actually one of the spiritual hearts of the story, and she is a powerful foil to Theo's nihilistic cynicism and unbelief. She goes head to head with Theo throughout key sequences in the novel, and she's strong and capable and able to do that. In the film, though, the new Miriam is just an airhead. They are not people who could match wits. She wouldn't stand a chance against him. And basically, like, you have this hippie who is doing things like, at one point in the film, she performs some new age ritual. It looks like she's trying to cleanse the chakra of Julian, who is now dying of a gunshot wound. Like, why would she be doing this? This is just madness. That is not the Miriam that we have in the novel. It's a completely different character. And I think it would have actually just been far better if she had been excluded completely from the film. Like, they just had not had this character, rather than to belittle what is a formerly great literary character in this film version by writing this anemic and pale version. Especially since in the film version, she provided and did no meaningful thing in the film. Like, her main role is to deliver the baby safely into the world, but she's not there for that. Theo does that, and Theo's clearly got the experience because he's already had a baby. He knows what he's doing. He doesn't even need Miriam. So Miriam is just a hanger-on in the film. She is literally taking up space, and she has no meaningful role in this film. So it would have been far better just to have left her out of the story rather than to rewrite her in this way. And then, ironically, her most important contribution to the film is actually to deliver an important little monologue but the way that scene is crafted is kind of clunky, and these are the weaknesses. When I say this film has some weaknesses, there's not many, but these are the weaknesses I am thinking of, and they are all around this character, or mainly around this character. But basically there's this monologue that she delivers about what happens to a world where the sound of children's voices is lost, and it's a beautiful, deep little monologue. But even that kind of doesn't quite make sense, because she's previously not been this deep, thoughtful, philosophical character. She's this new age hippie, and she's like, as I said, she's an airhead, and now all of a sudden she's expounding this deep philosophical wisdom in a very serious kind of way. It's not really congruent with who she was previously, but let's leave that little thing aside, because the other thing is the clunky nature of the way it gets delivered. It's beautiful, and what she says is great, and the way she actually delivers it is well delivered, but the initial setup is clunky. They are in an abandoned old school when the scene unfolds, and Theo walks into this abandoned classroom and he looks out the window, and he doesn't realise, like if you watch the film again you'll see this, he doesn't realise that Miriam is actually in the room. She's in a corner. He doesn't see her as he enters the room, and he doesn't engage her, but all of a sudden, totally uninvited and with no build-up or setup, no motivating trigger for this to happen, she just suddenly starts delivering this serious monologue about the loss of children's voices in the world and what happens to a world without children's voices. It's beautiful, it's important, but it's the kind of thing that would only normally happen if conversation was taking place between characters. So a character like Theo comes into the room and he says something that motivates, that triggers, that makes sense of why a character sitting in the corner would suddenly just start monologuing about this deep and profound philosophical truth without actually engaging in any prior conversation with the person in the room. Like, no one does that. And so it was clunky. And to me, it's kind of a metaphor actually for what they've done to Miriam in the film. And like I said, this is a great film, but I really wish they hadn't messed this up. Because Miriam in the film, it sort of feels like they just don't know what to do with her as a character. And basically, that's kind of a metaphor. What you see happening here is that, like, they don't know what to do with Miriam as a character, and she sort of is just there doing clunky things, and she's in these clunky scenes. And it's really those scenes where the film is at its weakest, in my opinion. And of course, the other thing that the film does differently is it completely removes that whole ring of power type idea, the Lord of the Rings, where you have Theo taking the ring of power for himself. And this is kind of important actually, because Theo is someone who likes to think he's better than others, and this is kind of foreshadowed earlier in the novel, because earlier in the novel he accuses other members of the Five Fishes of basically only wanting power for themselves, and he claims to have seen through their supposedly pure motivations, and they're really just another version of Zan and the oligarchical council. They want power for themselves because they don't like the world. They just want to take control, basically, because they don't like it. It's not that they really care about injustice. That's what he accuses them of. Well, ironically, that's exactly what he does at the end of the film. We'll come back to that point. One other little thing that I actually found about the film version too was that the reveal of the pregnancy, this first human pregnancy in decades, the revelation of that, even though the film does it really well, it's a great sequence, don't get me wrong, it's not bad at all, but I didn't find it as powerful as the reveal in the novel. And in the novel, it has a bit more impact, and that's because what happens is Theo and Miriam are driving together in a car to go to where Julian is, and Miriam is the one who reveals to Theo that Julian is pregnant, but Theo's reaction is one of skepticism and of anger. He thinks they're delusional. He thinks maybe they're lying. He thinks maybe that this poor woman might even have cancer, and so her bloating in the stomach is actually some disease that's going to kill her, and they've completely messed this up. He's skeptical about Miriam and whether she really is as competent and capable as a midwife, like as she claims to be. And it's quite important. All of that happens in that reveal. You don't get any of that in the film version. Straight away, Theo is on board. He's bought into it. And it's a shame. I know why they've done it, and the film version is great, but at the same time, it kind of would probably make a little bit more sense if, even in a small way in the film version, Theo was a little bit more skeptical about what he was seeing. Not just overjoyed, but a bit skeptical. Is this woman really pregnant? Like you see in the novel version. Now, of course, the the novel version has the ability to write dialogue that's going on, or not dialogue, the thoughts, the narration, the inner monologue, the inner narration of the characters in the head. You can see that on a page. It's a bit hard to do that in a film. But I found the pregnancy reveal just to be a bit more impactful, because it's not just the character build-up in the novel, because it doesn't give any indication that this is actually going to be Julian and Luke's character arcs, like they're going to be the new Adam and Eve. Because in the novel, the pregnancy comes later in the novel. It's in the second half of the novel. And in fact, it's really in the final third of the novel, actually, if I remember the length of the novel correctly. But the five fishes basically in the novel are introduced to us as a group of activists who are concerned with the unjust treatment of the elderly people through the quitus euthanasia ritual, with the unjust treatment of the sojourners, with the unjust treatment of the prisoners in the Isle of Man, and of course, they also are concerned about the lack of democratic elections. And so that's their focus. That's who they are. They don't exist to try and save humanity through a pregnant woman. That comes later. And basically, later on we discover in the novel, well after that, that Julian is actually pregnant and Luke is the father. So it's not just that difference, so that when the pregnancy comes, it's a much bigger revelation. But there's also a whole dialogue between Theo and Miriam, like I said, in that car, when she reveals to him that Julian is pregnant, and that's missing completely from the film. Now, to be fair to the film, like I said, I'm not sure how they could have captured all of that depth, because they don't have the written word to work with, but also, once they committed to changing the story in the way that they did, I don't know how you capture some of that stuff. This is a byproduct, effectively, of some of the changes in vision that they have decided to embark upon in this film version. Which brings me full circle all the way back to the original novel, and to, I think, one of the most important and essential thematic elements that has been completely removed from the film adaptation, and to its detriment. Like, P.D. James is a phenomenal writer. She doesn't do, for example, things like Deus Ex Machina. Think about the example I mentioned right back at the beginning of this video of Theo killing Zan. He shoots him in the heart using a gun, a pistol, that has only one bullet left in it. Now, if that had happened at the end of that novel, under normal circumstances, you would think, what the heck? He's an Oxford historian. He's a university professor. How did he become so handy with a gun all of a sudden that he could shoot and kill a man at distance using a pistol with only one bullet? How does that make sense? Well, it's because right back at the beginning of the novel, this is not Deus Ex Machina, it doesn't come out of nowhere. Right back at the beginning of the novel, P.D. James sets all of this up when she tells us that when they were young as children, as cousins, Zan and Theo used to spend their summers at Zan's family estate, and while they were there, one of the activities they would get up to in their leisure time was shooting targets, and they even used a pistol as one of the guns. And it turns out that, to his surprise, we discover, because part of the novel is told like a traditional narrator narrates events to us, and the other part of it is the narration from the memoirs of Theo. The character of Theo is reading to us his own memoirs. And to his own surprise, he discovers that he was actually better than Zan, and he was quite good at target shooting. And so then this is what you might call Chekhov's rifle, Chekhov's gun. It's introduced in the very first act, and then in the final act, what happens? That actually comes to fruition, and so therefore that explains why he's actually quite proficient with a pistol and is able to shoot and kill Zan so efficiently, because he knows what he's doing, right? And so there's no Deus Ex Machina. No one is suddenly grabbed off a bus in a way that doesn't really quite make sense. Her characters are phenomenally well written. Her writing style is beautiful. It's almost like slipping into a warm bath, where just the words and the prose, they just envelop you in a way that's, it's awesome. I love the writing style in The Children of Men. There's something quintessentially English about it. In fact, I would even go as far as comparing it to Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited. Now, I know that's high praise, but there are a lot of similarities here. There's a quintessentially English style of writing in P.D. James' work, and you really get that in The Children of Men. So what this means is there's no cheap gimmicks, there's no cliches happening here. The end of her novel doesn't tie a nice, neat little cliched bow around things. It doesn't provide trite conclusions. Instead, it shows us that Theo's journey of redemption, which we thought was actually starting to come to a place of completion, is actually not yet complete at all. He takes the ring of power for himself. It also shows us that the people living in this world of great selfishness, because there has been no new human life, wouldn't suddenly become paragons of virtue just because a miracle birth has happened in their midst. That's not realistic. That's not how human frailty, our human condition, our sinfulness, and our tendency, our struggle with evil, that's not how it works. It's not like you experience a miracle and then all of a sudden, as a direct result of seeing a birth of a human baby, you suddenly turn into a person of virtue. No, virtue is about habit. It's about decisions, and it's about doing things like choosing consistently to turn away from evil and to choose good. And as you do more and more of that, the habitus, as the Greeks would call it, of virtue builds up in your life. It's not like one thing suddenly changes you in that way. And so this novel is very realistic about all of this and about Theo's selfishness. Because one of the essential elements of the novel that is almost completely absent from the film, apart from one cliched moment of dialogue, again involving Miriam, where Theo and Miriam, Theo gets angry because just after watching Jasper be killed by the fishes, Miriam says that, everything happens for a purpose, and he gets really angry about that. Where is your God? What's the purpose in this? And rightly so, because it was just a silly thing for her to say in that moment. And the way it was delivered, she had not earned the right to say that to this other character at all. And it's not great writing, basically. Again, Miriam, so much of the flaws, the imperfections in this film revolve around that particular character and the fact that they have underwritten her. They've not written her well at all. But that's the only brief allusion to this, whereas in the novel it is much more well developed. It's a key and essential theme, and that is the fact that Theo struggles with faith and the role of God in human suffering. The question of divine providence is a big factor in all of this, and it's a big part of Theo's journey, and it's completely missing from the film, or almost completely missing, apart from that brief and inferior scene that we see. You see, the children of men is actually a term that comes directly from the Christian and Jewish scriptures. It's a theologically rich idea that speaks to the dignity of human beings, like every human being made in the image of God. And so there is a dignity, the children of men. There's something profound and important about this. But it also, that phrase, delineates the separation between God and humanity, and the fact that we need redemption. Because what you see in the New Testament, that contrast actually becomes quite clear when the New Testament starts using the phrase, the children of God, to describe those who have chosen to believe and follow Christ. So basically what you're getting here is now this delineation. It's no longer just that we are the imago Dei, the image of God, and we have a certain dignity, but when we follow Christ and give ourselves to Him, the idea here is that there is a flourishing of our human dignity in a new and profound and wondrous kind of way. A whole new life is opened up to us. And so this is a really rich and important theological term, and that's the very name of the novel. And so, the children of men. And what you get in the film version, remember earlier I talked about how they changed the title from The Children of Men to Children of Men? In the original novel, The Children of Men describes humanity as a whole. It describes humanity's condition, our state. It's quite an important little theological pointer to the depth of what's being explored in the story. But when you just change that title by removing the word that and change it to children of men, all of a sudden what happens now is there's an emphasis shift that is kind of subtle but also kind of powerful. The shift now is on the idea of not the children of men, but children who are born to men and women. And it sort of focuses more on the infertility aspect of it. And this is, I think, quite an important loss because, like the character of Theo in the novel, he spends all of his time judging the other characters. He's basically this guy who sits in judgment consistently over other people. He's critiquing their motivations. He can tell us what he thinks is wrong with them and what their flaws are. And ironically, he fails himself at the final hurdle when it matters most. This guy who effectively presents himself, he doesn't present himself as being like some perfect virtuous man, but he definitely, the way his inner monologue works is effectively he really thinks of himself as being morally superior to others. And it's not like an arrogance, it's not that, it's very real, but it's the human struggle that we all have. We really like to point out the faults in others, but very rarely do we recognise our own faults, and we certainly don't recognise, and this is something for Theo, this character, that the reason he's so capable of seeing these faults in other people, like when he's judging the 5 fishes and their motivations, is because he himself has exactly the same fault within him, and that's exactly what happens at the end of the novel. He does the very thing that he accuses them of doing. He becomes the very thing that he claims they are. And ironically, what happens is, as well, is this nihilistic cynicism clouds his vision to such a degree that he fails to recognise that he, Theo Farron, is actually the very work of God in the world that he claims that he cannot see anywhere. Where is God? Where is he in the midst of this? Where is God at work? He's not at work. I can't see him working. That's basically Theo and his approach to the world in a nutshell. But here's the thing. He is that very gift of God. He is the very work of God. Theo is short for Theodore. The name Theodore means God's gift. And that's exactly what Theo is in this novel. He is this gift from God to these other characters. We tend to think that it's only the child, the new child that has been born, that is the gift of God, but in actual fact, Theo is a gift to these characters. The 5 fishes and the future of humanity would not be secured if it wasn't for Theo. But guess what? Theo can't do this on his own. He needs them as well. He can't save the world without Julian, without Luke. But here's the thing, he lacks humility. His vision is clouded by this nihilistic skepticism, so he doesn't see that in actual fact, the work of God is not this consistently extraordinary thing. The extraordinary work of God is actually through the ordinary things of life that we take for granted. I think I talked about this previously on a podcast episode where I went in depth and explored the deeper themes of the film The Exorcist. And one of the important things about that film is this idea, and also the novel, in fact it's a trilogy of books, some people don't realise that, but it's a trilogy of stories, about where is God in the world. That's really the themes that are being explored in these novels by William Peter Blatty. And one of the key aspects is, like we look at the world and we go, oh, there's suffering in the world, where is God in the midst of suffering? And effectively one of the answers that The Exorcist provides is, look, if you think this is a world without God, you're not looking closely enough, because in actual fact, this is what a world without God really looks like, where evil is in total control. And that's the world of a young, innocent girl who is possessed by this demonic entity, and there is total darkness and nihilism. That's what a world without God looks like. We don't live in that world. We are just failing to recognise the ordinary way in which God is at work, and that's really Theo's struggle here in The Children of Men. Like, The Children of Men, from my perspective, is one of the greatest modern dystopias that's ever been written. It is also, unfortunately, one of the most criminally underrated works, and I really wish more people would read it. In fact, I wish that instead of making kids read The Handmaid's Tale in high schools, they actually made them read The Children of Men instead. I think it's far more prescient for us. And I think when you combine this with something like Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, you have a very, and certainly far more accurate picture of the world that we find ourselves living in. And it touches on some really big and important themes that are very pressing and very prescient for the world that we find ourselves living in right now. And so it's a phenomenal and very important, but also unfortunately underrated dystopia. Now the film is also an amazing cinematic creation. Nothing I've said here is to say this film is garbage. It is not. It is, as I said, one of the pinnacle moments of modern cinema, and it is absolutely one of the best films that's ever been made. However, I just wish that it had maintained the beating heart of the original novel, which gave richness and life to the original story, and which meant that the original novel scales these great heights and it plumbs these very rich depths, which unfortunately the film doesn't do because of some of these choices that were made in the adaptation, the cinematic adaptation of the original work by P.D. James. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm going to give you a little pop quiz in just a second. And if you know the answer to this pop quiz, please put your answer in the comments section below. But before I do that, a huge thank you to all of my patrons. It's thanks to you that this video was made possible. If you want to support our work, you can do that in a couple of ways. One, go to patreon.com/leftfootmedia and become a patron, a monthly patron for any amount at all. $1 if you want to. It doesn't matter, any amount at all. And if you do that, you will get a free episode every single week of our new audio podcast called The Lamp. The Lamp is an audio podcast exclusively for our supporters. And in that podcast, we unpack a different passage of the Christian scriptures each week, and we take a really deep dive into them. What is the deeper meaning? What's going on in these passages? So if that sounds like you, become a supporter with any amount. If you want to get a daily episode of my audio podcast, The Dispatches, where I explore current affairs, cultural events, and politics and other things from an authentically Burkean conservative perspective, so every single day of the week, Monday through Friday, you get an episode. All you have to do to get access to that is become a $5 monthly patron at patreon.com/leftfootmedia. Again, a huge thank you to all of my patrons. It's thanks to you that this video was made possible today. Alrighty, pop quiz time. Behind me on this wall is an image that is a very specific reference to the children of men. So there is an image on my well-crafted backdrop here that actually has direct correlation, direct relevance to the children of men. If you can tell me which of these images is relevant to the children of men, please put your answer in the comments section below, and I promise you I will do you the honor of giving your comment a huge thumbs up. I'll even give it one of those heart likes, right? So yeah, you will have the honor of knowing that you are a very astute individual. But if you can figure out which of these images is relevant to the children of men, please let me know in the comments section below. Also, please don't forget to like the video. That really helps. Give it a thumbs up, and also to share. If you're not a subscriber, please subscribe to the channel. And as I said, pass the video around, let your friends know. All of that really helps the channel. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget, live by goodness, truth, and beauty, not by lies. And I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media.